Design, coming at you from my new home art room. Now today we're going to look at Star Wars, this Princess Leia, which has actually been a little bit controversial. Now, 1977, this was the time the original Star Wars came out, and coincidentally the time my baby JB was born. And what can be more iconic than the original Princess Leia? White gown, R2D2, Tatooine setting, the whole lot. Now this was a really fun piece to do. This was also one that I put up on a Facebook page, which got a whole lot of fun comments, and being a pretty fun guy, reading through those comment section was an absolute scream and an absolute laugh. So had an absolute ball reading through that with some pretty wild imaginations out there. Now this was a beautiful sculpt, and this was sculpted by CO3D, and I bought this file from CO3D Art. So if you are looking at buying this file, give those guys a shout out. Now we're going to take and have a look at all the paintwork and processes that we got to get this final little piece, Princess Leia from Star Wars A New Hope. So the first thing we're going to look at is my flesh tones. Here's a list of all the flesh tones I use, and these are the same for all of my projects, and I go in that order. I then use my base tone, and from there I'll start working my shadows and highlights through those tones that I've just showed you. And then I like to tone it back with the elfic flesh, and that really gets some good highlights in all the areas that need lighting. Now here's all the different areas together, and I like to make sure I get that really good consistency. So I like to make sure I get all the skin tones done together. You can see through some of the legs we have some nice lighting effects. We have those shadows and highlights in. And then we come all the way around, and we're also going to have a look at the face. Now she's got some pink cheeks. Princess Leia in the movies has quite pink cheeks, and also through that eyeshadow. So I've tried to match those up really well. Now as I shift that into the light, you can see I've also used some metal coat on top of the eyelids, and that just gives it that real princess look and gives it a little bit of that shimmer and a bit of a glisten through there, and I think that one looks really effective. We then get some nice work on the hands, and then we also have a look at the torso, and we're having a look through the chest where there's some nice shadows and highlights, and flipping around through the back. So there's a really good consistency throughout, and I'm happy with that so far. We then get onto my favourite section, and this is the eyes, and the first thing that I'm going to do with the eyes is just blacken them out, and that makes it a little bit easier. So then I put a light grey in, and I can really shape up all those eyelashes with the black underneath. From there, I then wanted to mask out her face with some silly putty and start putting some brown in the hair. I use lots of different shades of brown here. I start with a mid-tone and then go with some darker and also some lighter areas. And then I actually really get out the highlights with some dry brushing. So I take the dry brush to it and make sure that we get all that happening. Once I've done that, it then allows me, once I've framed the face, to get the same colour tones through the eyes. So I use the same brown tones and go through the eyes, and then sharpen those shapes up with a toothpick. Just by doing that I can get some really nice clean shapes, and I think that's really important for those eyes. I then go through the lips as well, where I start with a nice mid-tone and then start working deeper red. She's got quite red lips in the movies, so we go with a deeper red and get some streaks. Now here she is all put together. She has all the streaks through, all the dry brushing, the highlights through the eyes, and everything's looking really good together. This is just a nice, more high resolution picture where we can also see a little bit through the cheeks, and we're really happy with Princess Leia, looking very Princess Leia-ish, and we're going to move on to the next section. Now moving on to her body, the first part that I attacked was the boots, and I made sure I got some really nice white gloss on those boots, and then really put some shadows and highlights throughout that. I put a few greys, and then I put some ivory in there as well, just to break it up and give it a slightly different tone of white. And then I was able to tackle the heels, and with all the soles they were pretty brown, so I made sure I got some good shades of brown in there, and then gave that a good dry brush to make it look authentic. It was then time to tackle all the clothing and the big gown. And I've given everything a strong coat of white all the way throughout before I started building very soft shadows and highlights with some light greys. I then got some darker greys and started really getting into some of those recesses and making them quite dark. And as we turn it around, we can see some of those bits are quite dark in there. So I wanted to get some a fair bit darker than the other where the shadows were going to hit. And then the most important part was to come back and fog those back. And you can see I'm sitting quite far back with the airbrush with white, softening all of those back in the areas that needed it and giving it a really nice silky look and making sure all of those shadows look just right. Then there were some pieces on the hood that needed to be filled, so I used that with some Milliput, got rid of some of the dimples on there as well, and then gave it the same treatment with a few highlights and then misting over the top of it with the white. Now if we look at the dress from the movie, there was quite a silky finish which I wanted to try to emulate. So I got some of this metal medium from Vallejo and masked out all the areas, and the idea was to give it a nice soft coat to give it a real pearlized sheen and just give it a bit of a magical effect. So I stood fairly far back and gave it just a very light coat of everything, and as we can see, it looks really effective as we go and have a look at Princess Leia all the way through that torso. And then I did the same on the lower half. This was great because it also created some different contrast and textures. It's quite a white model, so within the boots and also R2D2, which are very white based, it just created a little bit of a contrast between all the different pieces. Now some of you have been very concerned about R2 and his intentions, but sorry to burst your bubble, I can assure you here, as we can see on the top, that all his vents are closed and we don't see any periscopes, probes, etc. coming up. So anything there I think you can leave to your imagination, but it's all a bit of fun and we're going to move on from there. So now it was time to move on to R2, and the first thing I did was give it a good base coat of white. Having a look at some of the detail here. Now as we can see, one of the vents looks a little bit different. I had to fix that because the print didn't work out, so I fixed it using a little bit of Lego and also a little bit of vinyl over the top. Now after base coating R2, it was important to get his vents right, and so what I used was this grey art line because I wanted to make sure I got really clean lines on that. I was able to do that all the way over, and then once I did that I got my airbrush and put a little bit of weathering in all of those vents just to make them look weathered, just to make them look like they had a bit of dirt in there, a few scorch marks, etc. And then I was going to hit those later with some pastels. Now after I'd hit all the vents and give them some detail, I made sure I put the shiny silver on the dome to get ready for all the blue and make sure it looked very authentic to R2D2. So it was then time to mix the blue, and I used some metallic blue paint, Mecha Color, and I also put that with a nice bright dark blue as well. And I mixed those together, as well as a nice candy ink from Green Stuff, just because it's a bit more toon based. I started spraying some of those layers and making sure that I lay it over the top to give it a really clean blue finish. Now after that came the good part, peeling it all off, and once I peeled everything off, everything looked nice and sharp. That was also going to be detailed, but as a nice flat colour, I was really happy with the way that that worked out for R2. I then used one of my books for reference to have a look at all the detail, have a look at the hoses which look kind of brown, and have a look where all the extra scorch and dirt marks came into R2, and really try to replicate all of that. I actually used some pastels for that as well, just to keep it nice and soft. I used lots of different browns and also some blacks, and as we can see, everything started to look nice and sharp. Now, when we have a look at R2 here, we can see all the colours look really good. The lens on top is also looking good. And then I wanted to make sure I used the little red dot. And I used some vinyl here just so I can get that real reflective shimmer effect. Cut some dots out of that, and I was able to put that on. Now, when we have a look, you can see that just reflecting in the light a little bit, and that's just the look I was after. And depending on the light, you can see that nice reflective work in the red. Now from there was a simple case of test fitting Leia's bottom half onto R2. Everything looked just as I wanted it to. I got all the detailing and everything just as I wanted, so happy with that. And now we're about to move on to the next section, onto the base, and we'll put it all together. So it was time to move on to the base, and the first thing that we needed was there's going to be a contrast between some sand colour and also some wood grain around the plinth on the bottom. Now from here I wanted to base coat them with the same colour, and what we can see here is it fully coated, and this is using Desert Tan from Vallejo. And the idea was to make sure that we could get the nice streaks in for the wood grain, but also we wanted to start with a light base around the top, and then it was going to be set up nicely to be able to put some little splatters in and also some speckling effect for the sand and have it look really sharp overall. So I then went to work using all these different colours to make sure I got some shading in, and also a lot of speckling effects to make it look a lot more like sand on the top. So I used my Mac valve and I tightened that all the way up just so I could get that speckling effect through my airbrush. I tested that on my hand first, and once I got that just as I wanted, I went to work all the way over and used all those different colours from darkest to lightest. So what we can see here, this is a darker version of it, but I've got all my shadows and highlights and it's been speckled. Now you can have a look at the lightsaber and you can see a lot of that speckling on top of that, just to give that effect. You can't see all of it on top here, you get a bit of a feel for it, but in person there was a lot more speckling effect. I then went to work on the top and dry brushed it all back. This was a really important area because I wanted to make sure that all the cracks and all the little areas around and all the highlights and shadows looked a bit lighter, and we got that just as we wanted, but we got all the speckling effects and the dark shadows still coming through. It was then time to start on the base, and I wanted to have that wood grain finished. I used a toothbrush just to put in some dark highlights, and I splattered that all the way around. And once we finished, this is what we look. It looks a bit of a mess at this stage, but now we're going to soften it back with a whole bunch of browns and have it look very wood-like. So from here you can see me airbrushing different shades. I use lots of different shades of brown to get that sort of Jarrah oak type look and just soften everything back. Once I did that, I put a nice gloss or satin coat over the top just to give it a good wood grain feel, and it created a really nice contrast between all of the sand on the top and also that wood grain down the bottom. I was also able to paint that lightsaber just in detail and then start to piece Leia and everything together to have a look at our final product. The final piece of the puzzle was just to create a little plaque, and that just put a little cherry on top and got Princess Leia ready for display. The first thing I did was got some 2mm thick acrylic, and this was just clear, and I painted the back of that with black so it really looked good from the front. I then used my Cricut Air and had a Princess Leia logo cut out in gold vinyl and put that over the top and then peeled back the layer. Once that was peeled back, I had to get a few little air bubbles and things out of that, but I then cut it to size. And as we can see, it looked really sharp, and it was just that cherry on top that had her ready for display and ready to set off the piece. So guys, if you like what you saw today, please click that like and subscribe button. It's the best way we can keep putting content out there and getting things out there for the community, as I always say. Now again, this one had a little bit of controversy in it and it was all in good fun, so it was fantastic to just be able to put out an art piece which gave people a bit of fun and a bit of banter. So if you'd like to put some stuff in the comment section, we always love to hear from you in there. Other than that guys, take care, be good, and all the best. We'll see you next time.